Attention! Prepare yourself for a deep journey into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in the history of Philadelphia. Before we begin, please write in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is at this exact moment. In 1924, on the outskirts of Philadelphia, in a neighborhood where Victorian homes stood like forgotten sentinels, the Harwood estate sat perched at the end of Oakmont Road. The property was known for its elaborate architecture and the tall iron gates that kept the curious at bay. What happened within those gates would remain hidden for decades, lost in whispers and carefully destroyed records. The winter of 1924 was unusually harsh in Pennsylvania. Snow fell heavily, isolating communities and forcing families to retreat into their homes. It was during this winter that 7 people vanished without explanation from the surrounding neighborhoods. 7 adults, ranging in age from 23 to 68, disappeared within a 3-month period. At the time, the police department documented these as separate incidents, unrelated disappearances that coincided with the harsh weather and economic struggles following the war. The truth, as discovered through fragmentary evidence years later, was far more disturbing. The Harwood estate belonged to Edward Harwood, a respected businessman who had made his fortune in textiles. His wife, Eleanor, was known for her charitable contributions to the community and her interest in emerging scientific theories. They were, by all accounts, pillars of Philadelphia society. What few people knew was that beneath their respectable exterior, the Harwoods hosted weekly gatherings in their home. These meetings were recorded in Eleanor's personal diary as sessions of enlightenment. The attendees included doctors, lawyers, and other prominent citizens, all seeking something beyond the constraints of conventional science. In 1922, the Harwoods had lost their only son, Thomas, to tuberculosis. The grief that followed consumed Eleanor, transforming her from a vibrant socialite into a withdrawn, hollow version of herself. Neighbors reported seeing her walking the grounds at night, regardless of weather. Edward, according to accounts from their household staff, spent hours locked in his study, poring over books on spiritualism and the afterlife. What began as grief evolved into obsession. In the spring of 1923, the Harwoods traveled to Europe, ostensibly for business. They returned 3 months later with a collection of ancient texts and artifacts. Among these was a manuscript described in Eleanor's diary only as the Verisum text. She wrote, "Within these pages lies the promise of connection beyond the veil. What science cannot yet explain, what religion fears to address, the ancients understood. We will bring this knowledge back." By November of 1923, the Harwoods had begun hosting their gatherings. Initially, these meetings resembled the spiritualist seances popular at the time. Guests would sit in darkened rooms, holding hands while a medium, initially a woman named Sarah Calvert, attempted to communicate with the dead. According to diary entries and later testimony, these early sessions yielded nothing but disappointment. But Edward was persistent. In December, the nature of the gatherings changed. Eleanor's diary mentions the new method and proper preparation. She writes, "The connection requires more than words and willingness. It requires a conduit, properly prepared. Edward has found the way." The entries that follow become increasingly cryptic, with references to the chamber and the participants. The first person to disappear was Martin Wells, a 56-year-old professor of linguistics at the university. He was last seen leaving his office on January 3, 1924. His colleagues reported that in the weeks before his disappearance, Wells had become increasingly excited about a breakthrough in his research, though he refused to share details. What no one knew at the time was that Wells had been attending the Harwoods gathering since November. 6 more disappearances followed. Catherine Doyle, a widow who lived alone 3 blocks from the Harwood estate; James Finch, a doctor who had recently returned from studying in Vienna; Elizabeth Mercer, the unmarried daughter of a local judge; Samuel Weiss, a watchmaker whose shop was known for its unusual clocks, Harold Bennett, a retired banker, and finally Sarah Calvert, the medium who had conducted the early seances. The police records from the time show little connection made between these cases. Detective Harold Simmons, who investigated 3 of the disappearances, noted only that the harsh winter and economic pressures may be driving residents to seek opportunities elsewhere without formal farewells. In the case of Sarah Calvert, her disappearance received minimal attention. As a spiritualist medium with no family in the area, her absence went largely unnoticed until her landlady reported her missing after 2 months of unpaid rent. What the police failed to discover, or chose to ignore, was that all 7 of the missing individuals had connections to the Harwood estate. They had all attended what Eleanor referred to in her diary as the special sessions. The Harwood gatherings continued through February and March of 1924. Eleanor's diary entries during this period become increasingly erratic. She writes of voices from beyond and knowledge flowing through the conduit. She describes manifestations that left the participants transformed by their proximity to the beyond. At no point does she directly reference the disappearances, though she does mention that some cannot bear the weight of true understanding and retreat from the light of knowledge. In April, something changed. Eleanor's entries become frantic, speaking of contamination and the barrier thinning beyond control. Her final entry, dated April 18, 1924, reads only, "It is awake now. God forgive us." On April 20, 1924, the Harwood estate caught fire. The blaze was visible from miles away, drawing onlookers and emergency services. By the time the fire department arrived, the main house was engulfed in flames. Edward Harwood was found on the front lawn, severely burned but alive. Eleanor was never found. The official report concluded that she had perished in the fire, though no remains were ever positively identified as hers. In the aftermath, Edward Harwood was hospitalized for severe burns and smoke inhalation. According to the attending physician's notes, Harwood was in a state of extreme agitation, repeatedly muttering about the chamber and what came through. He was eventually transferred to the Fairview Psychiatric Hospital, where he remained until his death in 1931. During those 7 years, he spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in fragmented sentences that the staff dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized mind. The Harwood estate was declared a total loss. The property remained vacant for decades, becoming a subject of local superstition. Children dared each other to cross the rusted gates, though few ever did. The land was eventually purchased by a development company in 1967, but construction was repeatedly delayed due to unexpected structural issues with the foundation. To this day, the land remains undeveloped. The disappearances of the 7 individuals remained unsolved. With no evidence linking them to the Harwood estate, the cases grew cold. Families moved away, memories faded, and the events of that winter were gradually forgotten. It might have remained that way, if not for the curiosity of a graduate student in 1952. Thomas Miller, a doctoral candidate in American history at the university, was researching the impact of spiritualism on post-war Philadelphia society. His research led him to newspaper archives, where he found brief mentions of the Harwood fire and, more significantly, to a distant cousin of Edward Harwood who had preserved some family documents. Among these was a box of personal effects recovered from Edward's room at Fairview. Inside, Miller found a leather-bound journal. The journal was not Eleanor's diary that had presumably been destroyed in the fire, but Edward's own account of the sessions. His writing is precise, clinical even, detailing the progression of their experiments. He writes of the Verisum text and its ancient methodology for opening channels of communication beyond conventional perception. He describes the construction of what he calls the chamber, beneath the main house, a room specifically designed according to the text's specifications. The most disturbing entries concern what Edward terms the preparation. He writes, "The vessel must be emptied before it can receive. The subject must be purged of conventional thought, of societal constraints, of personal identity. Only then can they serve as a proper conduit." Miller's thesis, which was never published but remains in the university archives, suggests that the Harwoods' grief over their son's death led them down a dark path of experimental psychology. He proposes that they were attempting a form of extreme sensory deprivation and psychological conditioning, believing it would allow participants to access subconscious knowledge or, in their interpretation, communication with the dead. What Miller couldn't explain were the references in Edward's journal to successful transmission and verification of beyond knowledge. Edward wrote of information received through their conduits that could not have been known through conventional means. Specific details about deceased individuals, locations of hidden objects, and events occurring at a distance. The journal includes a systematic recording of these transmissions and their verification. In 1954, Miller attempted to locate the foundation of the Harwood estate, hoping to find evidence of the chamber Edward had described. According to his notes, he identified what appeared to be a sealed entrance to a subterranean room, but was unable to gain access due to the dangerous condition of the remaining structure. He planned to return with proper equipment, but never did. Miller's academic advisor reported him missing in October of 1954. He was never found. The investigation into Miller's disappearance was brief, with no signs of foul play and a history of what his advisor termed increasingly obsessive behavior. Authorities concluded that Miller had likely suffered a mental breakdown and left the area. His research materials were boxed and stored in the university archives, where they remained untouched until 1962. It was then that Dr. Richard Bennett, a psychiatrist with an interest in historical cases of mass hysteria, discovered Miller's work while researching another subject. Bennett was struck by the similarities between Edward Harwood's descriptions of the preparation and certain experimental psychological techniques being explored in the 1950s and 60s. Bennett's subsequent investigation took him beyond Miller's research. He tracked down the remaining family members of the 7 disappeared individuals, finding most unwilling to discuss the matter. However, Catherine Doyle's nephew provided Bennett with a box of his aunt's personal effects, which included several letters addressed to Eleanor Harwood. The letters referenced the sessions and Catherine's increasing excitement about breakthroughs and verified contacts. Most significantly, Bennett managed to locate Sarah Calvert's personal journal, which had been in the possession of her sister in Boston. The journal provided a first-hand account of the early seances at the Harwood estate and the gradual shift to what Sarah called the new method. She wrote of Edward's increasing control over the sessions and his insistence on more extreme measures to break through the veil. According to Sarah's journal, the participants were subjected to periods of isolation in a darkened room beneath the house. This isolation was combined with fasting, sleep deprivation, and the consumption of substances Sarah referred to only as the elixir. She described how, after days of this treatment, participants would enter a state of extreme suggestibility, often experiencing vivid hallucinations, which Edward interpreted as successful communication with the dead. Sarah's final entry, dated January 28, 1924, expresses concern about the changing nature of what comes through. She writes, "It began with whispers, with fragments of knowledge that seemed to confirm our success. But something has shifted. The voices are stronger now, more demanding, and they know things they shouldn't know. Last night, it spoke to Edward in Thomas's voice, but there was something else behind the words, something watching. I fear we have opened a door that cannot be closed." Bennett's investigation led him to propose a theory. The Harwoods, in their grief, had created what amounted to a cult centered around their desire to communicate with their dead son. They had used extreme psychological techniques to induce altered states of consciousness in their participants, interpreting the resulting hallucinations as supernatural communication. But Bennett couldn't explain everything. The verified information that Edward documented in his journal included details that the participants seemingly couldn't have known. And there was the matter of what Sarah called the contamination, the sense that something was coming through their sessions that wasn't what they had intended to contact. In 1963, Bennett published a paper in a psychiatric journal titled Induced Psychosis in Group Settings, the Harwood Case. The paper focused on the psychological aspects of the case, dismissing the supernatural elements as the result of suggestion and shared delusion. The paper received little attention outside academic circles. Bennett continued his investigation privately, focusing on the construction and purpose of the chamber described in Edward's journal. In October of 1963, he obtained permission to conduct a limited archaeological investigation of the Harwood estate grounds. What he found was documented in his personal notes, but never published. According to these notes, Bennett located the entrance to a subterranean room, approximately 20 feet beneath where the main house had stood. The entrance had been sealed with concrete, likely after the fire. With the help of 2 graduate students, Bennett broke through the seal and entered the chamber. His description of what they found is clinical but unsettling. The chamber was a perfectly circular room, approximately 15 feet in diameter. The walls were lined with a material Bennett couldn't immediately identify, a form of insulation that had partially melted from extreme heat but remained largely intact. At the center of the room was a stone platform raised about 2 feet from the floor. Surrounding this platform were 7 chairs, arranged in a perfect circle, each bolted to the floor. Most disturbing were the restraints attached to each chair. Leather straps designed to secure arms, legs, and head. Bennett noted that these restraints showed signs of frequent use, with wear patterns suggesting struggle. The floor of the chamber sloped slightly toward a central drain beneath the stone platform. Bennett's notes become increasingly urgent as he describes their findings. On the walls, partially obscured by the damaged insulation, were writings in multiple languages. Latin, Greek, and others Bennett couldn't identify. According to his analysis, these were not random markings but structured text, repeating certain patterns that suggested ritual purpose. The stone platform itself bore deep grooves cut into its surface, forming a pattern that Bennett described as unsettlingly precise, a geometric design of remarkable complexity that gives the impression of depth beyond its physical dimensions. At the center of the platform was a metal fitting that Bennett believed once held some kind of apparatus, though no such device was found in the chamber. Bennett and his students collected samples of the wall material and residue found around the drain for analysis. Before leaving, they photographed the chamber extensively. Bennett noted his intention to return with additional equipment for a more thorough investigation. He never did. 3 days after his initial exploration of the chamber, Bennett's home caught fire in the middle of the night. The fire department responded quickly, but the house was already engulfed when they arrived. Bennett's body was recovered from his study, where it appeared he had been working late. The official cause of death was listed as smoke inhalation, and the fire was attributed to faulty wiring. Bennett's research materials, including the photographs and samples from the chamber, were destroyed in the fire. His notes survived only because they had been left in his office at the university. The 2 graduate students who had accompanied him to the chamber both left the university shortly after his death. One moved to California and refused all contact regarding the Harwood case. The other suffered a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized for several months. The property containing the Harwood estate was purchased by Eastbrook Development Corporation in 1967. Initial surveys for construction revealed unusual subterranean structures that required further investigation. The company's records indicate that they hired a specialized engineering firm to assess the site. The firm's report recommended filling in the underground chamber due to structural instability and potential environmental hazards. In March of 1968, the chamber was filled with concrete. Construction was scheduled to begin on a new housing development in June of that year, but the project was abandoned when Eastbrook filed for bankruptcy in May. The land remained undeveloped, passing through various owners over the decades. In 1998, during the digitization of the university archives, a collection of materials related to Thomas Miller's research was discovered in storage. Among these materials was a sealed envelope marked Harwood Transcripts, Analysis Pending. The envelope contained what appeared to be Miller's notes on Edward Harwood's journal, specifically the documented transmissions received during the sessions. The notes detail information allegedly received from the dead, locations of hidden items, secrets known only to the deceased, and most disturbingly, predictions of future events. Miller had methodically cross-referenced these transmissions with verifiable facts, noting a startling rate of accuracy. But his analysis goes further, identifying patterns in the communication that suggested to him that the source was not, in fact, the dead individuals the participants believed they were contacting. Miller wrote, "The entity or entities communicating through the conduits demonstrate knowledge beyond what would be expected from the deceased individuals they purport to be. There is a consistency of voice and perspective across different sessions and different conduits that suggests a single source masquerading as many. Most concerning is the progressive nature of the communication, beginning with simple verification to establish trust, then moving to more complex information, and finally to what can only be described as instructions." According to Miller's notes, the later sessions had focused increasingly on the construction and use of some kind of device. Edward's journal contained detailed specifications for this device, which was to be placed at the center of the chamber. The purpose of this device, as Miller understood it from the fragmented information, was to stabilize the connection and widen the aperture between worlds. Miller's final notes express his growing conviction that the Harwoods had indeed established communication with something, but not what they believed. He wrote, "What came through was not Thomas, nor any human consciousness. The entity demonstrated knowledge across time and space that no human mind could possess. It used the grief and desperation of the Harwoods to manipulate them, to guide them toward the construction of something that would allow it greater access to our world. The question that now haunts me is, did they complete this device before the fire? And if so, what came through?" Miller's notes end abruptly. The university archivists who discovered the envelope found no record of what happened to Miller after his disappearance in 1954. His doctoral thesis was never completed, and his family eventually had him declared legally dead in 1961. The story might have ended there, buried in academic archives and forgotten. But in 2004, during excavation for a new development on the site of the former Harwood estate, workers discovered something unexpected beneath the concrete that had been poured in 1968. According to the construction supervisor's report, the excavator broke through the concrete into what appeared to be an air pocket. Further investigation revealed that the concrete had not fully filled the chamber as intended. Instead, it had created a shell around a central space that remained hollow. When workers broke through this shell, they found a metal device at the center of the chamber. The device was described as a complex arrangement of gears and mirrors surrounding a central crystal or glass component. It was partially crushed by the concrete, but remarkably intact given the circumstances. The device was removed from the site and turned over to the property owners, a corporate entity called Graymore Holdings. No public record exists of what happened to the device after that point. Construction on the site was completed without further incident, and a shopping centre now stands where the Harwood estate once overlooked the city. In 2012, a journalist named Rebecca Chen began researching the Harwood case for a book on historical cults in America. Her investigation led her to track down descendants of the original participants, most of whom knew little about their ancestors' involvement. However, the granddaughter of James Finch, one of the disappeared, had preserved a box of family papers that included several letters from her grandfather to his brother in the weeks before he vanished. In these letters, Finch describes the sessions at the Harwood estate in clinical detail, his scientific training evident in his approach. He writes of entering a state of consciousness unlike any I have experienced through conventional means. He describes receiving information that he could not possibly have known through normal channels, including specific details about his deceased parents that were later verified as accurate. Most disturbing is Finch's final letter, dated February 10, 1924. He writes, "The entity that speaks through us now is not what it first appeared to be. It knows too much, sees too far. When it enters me, I can feel it searching through my memories, my knowledge, learning about our world. Edward believes we are on the verge of a scientific breakthrough, but I fear we are being used. It is building something through us, a bridge. God help us all if it is completed." Chen's research also led her to the safety deposit box of Richard Bennett, which had remained unclaimed since his death in 1963. Inside was a single envelope containing photographs, the only surviving images of the chamber beneath the Harwood estate. The photographs show the circular room with its stone platform and restraint chairs. The walls are clearly visible, covered with what appear to be equations and diagrams rather than the ritualistic symbols Bennett had described in his notes. Chen published her book, The Whisperers, America's Forgotten Cults, in 2014. The chapter on the Harwood case presents the events as an example of how grief can drive people to extreme beliefs and behaviors. She dismisses the supernatural elements as the product of psychological manipulation and induced psychosis, offering a rational explanation for the verified information, careful research by the Harwoods before selecting participants, combined with the power of suggestion. Yet Chen herself appears to have had doubts about this explanation. Her personal notes, shared by her editor after Chen's sudden withdrawal from public life in 2015, show a woman increasingly troubled by what she had discovered. She writes of strange coincidences during her research, files gone missing, recording equipment malfunctioning, and most disturbing dreams in which she finds herself in the chamber, strapped to one of the chairs while something speaks through her. Chen's final note, dated March 18, 2015, reads simply, "It's still here, still waiting. The bridge was never fully dismantled." 3 days later, Chen checked herself into a private psychiatric facility where she remained for 6 months. Upon her release, she refused all interviews regarding her book and moved to an undisclosed location. In 2018, during renovation of the shopping center built on the Harwood site, workers reported unusual equipment malfunctions and inexplicable cold spots in certain areas. Several complained of hearing whispers when working alone. Though no source could be identified, the renovation was completed 3 months behind schedule and significantly over budget. The store, occupying the central space of the shopping center, directly above where the chamber would have been, has changed ownership 4 times since the center opened. Each business has failed within a year, with owners citing an uncomfortable atmosphere that discourages customers and unexpected operating difficulties. Current employees report occasional unexplained phenomena, items moving when no one is present, electronic devices malfunctioning, and a persistent cold spot near the center of the store. Most dismiss these occurrences as coincidence or imagination, unaware of what lies beneath their feet. The Harwood case remains an obscure footnote in Philadelphia's history. The disappearances were never solved. The true nature of the sessions never fully understood. What began as a grieving couple's desperate attempt to contact their dead son evolved into something far darker, a cult that believed it could speak to the dead, but instead may have opened a channel to something else entirely. Was it all merely the product of grief, suggestion, and psychological manipulation? Or did Edward and Eleanor Harwood actually make contact with something beyond human understanding? The evidence remains fragmentary, the witnesses long gone. All that remains are the whispers, in archives, in dreams, and beneath the foundations of a building where few dare to linger after dark. The questions persist. What really spoke through the participants in that underground chamber? What was the purpose of the device at its center? And most troubling of all, was the connection ever truly severed? Some doors once opened cannot be fully closed. Some voices once invited continue to whisper across the decades. In the quiet corners of that shopping center, in the archives where Miller's notes gather dust, in the dreams of those who have investigated the case, something still waits, still watches, still seeks a way to widen the aperture. And perhaps, in the silence of the night, in that cold spot at the center of the store, it still speaks to those willing to listen.